In Springfield, Oregon, a 57-year-old retired business consultant was about to face the most unexpected triumph of her life. What started as a simple family dinner erupted into bitter conflict when her daughter-in-law publicly humiliated her, setting off a chain of events that would transform both their professional lives forever. Margaret Wilson wasn't your typical interfering mother-in-law, and for 8 years she had tried building a relationship with her son's wife, known for her patient understanding. When she encountered the younger woman's calculated public shutdown at a family gathering, Margaret had no idea her daughter-in-law was making the biggest mistake of her career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's quiet expertise would lead to consequences no one saw coming. What began as a painful rejection would become the most valuable lesson in professional humility ever delivered. The silence in the Wilson family's spacious dining room felt heavier than the February rain drumming against the windows. Margaret sat at the end of the table, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, frozen in the moment as her daughter-in-law's words hung in the air like poison. With all due respect, Margaret, nobody asked for your business advice. Some of us have actual careers in the modern workplace. 8 years of trying to connect with Vanessa, 8 years of carefully offering support without overstepping, and now this public shutdown in front of the entire family. Margaret lowered her fork to her plate with the practiced composure of a woman who had navigated corporate boardrooms for 30 years before her retirement. Her son James looked mortified, his eyes darting between his mother and his wife with the panicked expression of someone trapped between two wildfires. Their 2 children, Emma and Noah, ages 10 and 8, stared down at their plates, uncomfortably aware of the sudden tension crackling across the table. "I was only suggesting," Margaret began, her voice measured. "That's exactly the problem," Vanessa cut in, smoothing her designer blouse with manicured fingers. "You're always suggesting, always hinting that I could be doing things better if I just listened to your outdated methods." At 36, Vanessa carried herself with the sleek confidence of someone who had climbed the corporate ladder at record speed, recently securing a director position at Apex Innovations, one of Springfield's fastest-growing tech companies. "I think Mom was just trying to help," James offered weakly, his voice barely audible above the rain. Vanessa turned to him with a look that silenced any further defense. "I don't need help from someone who retired before social media marketing even existed. The business world has changed, and honestly, I'm tired of the constant advice on how I should do my job, manage my team, or present my ideas." Margaret felt the familiar twist in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times when Vanessa subtly or not so subtly reminded everyone that Margaret's experience was obsolete, her insights irrelevant in today's fast-paced corporate environment. The painful irony wasn't lost on her as she watched Vanessa's profile, chin lifted in that self-assured pose that reminded her of so many young executives she'd mentored over the years, the ones who thought experience had an expiration date. At 57, Margaret had retired early not because she was outdated but because she'd been so successful. After building and selling her own consulting firm, she had chosen to step back and enjoy life while she was still young enough to travel, pursue hobbies, and spend time with family. Her portfolio of Fortune 500 clients and her reputation in business circles spoke for themselves, though Vanessa seemed determined to rewrite that history. "Perhaps you're right," Margaret said finally, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "I'll keep my suggestions to myself from now on." She reached for her water glass, using the moment to compose herself, unwilling to escalate the situation in front of her grandchildren. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. At 38, he'd built a respectable career as an architect, though never with the driving ambition his wife brought to her professional life. His gentle nature had always been both his strength and his weakness, a calming presence in tense situations but sometimes unable to stand firm when conflict arose. "Mom's advice has helped a lot of major companies," he said, attempting once more to smooth the waters. "Remember that time when she helped my firm restructure the client presentation process? It's still being used." "That was 4 years ago, James," Vanessa replied with the patient tone one might use with a child. "And a small architectural firm isn't exactly comparable to what I'm doing at Apex." "Speaking of Apex," James said quickly, clearly trying to change the subject, "how's the new product launch coming along?" The diversion worked. Vanessa's expression brightened as she launched into a detailed explanation of her team's latest project, her earlier irritation seemingly forgotten as she dominated the conversation with technical jargon and marketing strategies. Margaret listened quietly, noting the inconsistencies in the plan, the obvious gaps in consumer testing, the over-reliance on digital metrics without qualitative feedback, all observations she would have shared just weeks ago but now kept locked behind pressed lips. Across the table, Margaret caught Emma's eye. Her granddaughter offered a small, sympathetic smile that warmed Margaret's heart even as it underscored the painful reality. Even a 10-year-old could recognize the unfairness of the situation. After dinner, as Margaret helped clear the dishes, despite Vanessa's insistence that she was a guest and shouldn't have to clean up, she overheard her daughter-in-law in the living room. "I think I finally got through to her," Vanessa was saying in a low voice, presumably to James. "I know she's your mother, but the constant business advice was undermining me, especially when she does it in front of my colleagues. Do you know how embarrassing it was at the Christmas party when she started giving Simon her thoughts on our market expansion?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's hand stilled on the plates she was stacking. The Christmas party. She had exchanged perhaps 3 sentences with Simon Chen, Vanessa's boss, about the challenges of entering the Northeast market, a region where Margaret had extensive experience. It had been a casual conversation at the punch bowl, not some calculated attempt to undermine her daughter-in-law. "I just think Mom was trying to be helpful," James responded, his voice carrying that familiar note of conciliation. "She doesn't mean any harm." "Intent doesn't change impact," Vanessa replied firmly. "I've worked too hard to build my reputation to have it compromised by outdated advice from someone who thinks LinkedIn is cutting-edge technology." The unfairness of the characterization stung. Margaret had actually served on the advisory board of 2 tech startups after her retirement and maintained an active presence in business circles through both traditional and digital channels. She'd been using LinkedIn since its early days and had embraced each new platform as it emerged, not with the breathless enthusiasm of a trend follower but with the measured assessment of someone evaluating its true business value. But Vanessa had created a caricature of her that no amount of evidence seemed able to correct, the outdated mother-in-law stuck in business practices from another era, too stubborn or too oblivious to recognize her own irrelevance. As Margaret finished loading the dishwasher, she heard the conversation shift to the children's school projects, and she used the opportunity to slip away to the guest bathroom. Looking in the mirror, she saw a woman who barely resembled the confident executive she'd been for decades. Her silver-streaked dark hair was still styled in the practical bob she'd worn throughout her career, but her eyes held a shadow of uncertainty that hadn't been there before Vanessa entered their lives. A memory surfaced unbidden: James's wedding day 8 years ago. Margaret had spent weeks helping with arrangements, respecting Vanessa's vision while quietly handling issues before they became problems. She'd bought a new dress, something elegant that Vanessa had approved, and had even helped coordinate with difficult vendors when they threatened to derail the perfect day. But when the evening arrived, Vanessa had somehow managed to seat Margaret at the farthest table from the wedding party, next to distant relatives she barely knew. The photographer had accidentally excluded her from most family photos, and her thoughtful gift, a handcrafted memory book with space for wedding photos and future family milestones, had been set aside in favor of more expensive presents. James had been apologetic but quietly so. He danced with her for one song and told her that her efforts meant more to him than she knew, but she'd seen the conflict in his eyes, the beginning of a pattern where he would be caught between his mother and his wife, consistently choosing peace over principle. Margaret splashed cool water on her face and took a deep breath. "This isn't about you," she whispered to her reflection. "This is about Vanessa's insecurities." The pep talk felt hollow, even to her own ears. When she returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on to summer vacation plans. Vanessa was describing the executive retreat she'd been invited to attend in August, a prestigious gathering of up-and-coming business leaders selected for their innovative approaches to digital transformation. "Simon says it could be a career-defining opportunity," she explained, her voice brimming with pride. Only 20 directors from the entire country were chosen. "That's wonderful," Margaret said sincerely, determined to be supportive despite the earlier conflict. "Is it the Kaufman Foundation retreat? I remember when they first started that program." The momentary flash of annoyance across Vanessa's face told Margaret she'd once again stepped on an invisible line. "No, it's the Digital Vanguard Summit. It's fairly new, probably started after your time in business." The deliberate dismissal hung in the air. Margaret nodded, the implied message received clearly: "Your knowledge is outdated, your reference is irrelevant." "Actually," James interjected, "isn't Richard Kaufman one of the founders of that summit too? I think I read that somewhere." Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe he's on the advisory board, yes. But it's a completely different focus than the old-school business retreats." The conversation moved on, but Margaret felt the weight of each subtle dismissal accumulating like stones in her pocket. For 8 years, she had endured these small erosions of her dignity, these careful rewritings of her expertise and experience. She had told herself it was worth it to maintain peace in the family, to have access to her grandchildren, to support her son's marriage. But tonight, something had shifted. As the evening wound down and Margaret prepared to leave, she hugged her grandchildren tightly, inhaling the scent of Emma's strawberry shampoo and feeling Noah's small arms wrapped fiercely around her waist. "Will you still help me with my business project for school?" Emma whispered, referring to the entrepreneurship program her fifth-grade class was participating in. "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret assured her. "Anytime you want." Mom said. "You might be too busy," Emma confided, her voice small. The comment landed like a slap. Margaret pulled back slightly to look into her granddaughter's worried eyes. "I am never too busy for you. Never. Your project matters to me, and we'll make it the best in the class." Emma's smile bloomed, and Margaret felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This was worth enduring Vanessa's behavior. But something still needed to change, for everyone's sake. At the door, James embraced her with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry about dinner," he murmured. "Vanessa's under a lot of pressure with this product launch." "It's all right," Margaret assured him, though they both knew it wasn't. "We all have stressful moments." Vanessa offered a stiff farewell, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Thanks for coming, Margaret. Remember we have that family photo session next Sunday at 2. Try not to be late like last time." The parting shot, referencing a single occasion when Margaret had arrived 10 minutes late due to an accident on the highway, was so unnecessary that even James winced visibly. "I'll be there," Margaret promised, maintaining her composure with the same skill that had carried her through countless difficult business negotiations. "Thank you for dinner." As she drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Springfield, Margaret found herself reviewing the evening like a failed business strategy, identifying points of conflict and potential resolutions. The problem was clear, Vanessa perceived her as a threat to her professional identity, an outdated relic whose very presence undermined her carefully constructed image as a cutting-edge business leader. What wasn't clear was the solution. Continuing to endure the subtle and not-so-subtle humiliation seemed untenable. Confronting Vanessa directly would only escalate the situation and potentially limit her access to her grandchildren. Appealing to James had proven ineffective, his conflict-avoidant nature made him an unreliable ally in these situations. As she pulled into the driveway of her tasteful craftsman home, the home she'd purchased after selling her consulting business, Margaret caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were the same sharp green that had assessed business opportunities and evaluated executive potential for 3 decades. They had seen through corporate deception, identified emerging talent, and recognized market shifts before they appeared on any analyst's radar. What would those eyes see now, she wondered, if they looked at her current situation with the same clinical assessment she'd once applied to business challenges? The house felt emptier than usual as she unlocked the front door. Every room held echoes of the life she'd built for herself: the home office where she still occasionally advised former colleagues, the living room where she hosted book club meetings, the kitchen where she'd taught Emma how to make her great-grandmother's apple pie. But tonight, these comfortable spaces felt like a retreat rather than a sanctuary. Margaret set her purse on the hall table and moved through rooms that suddenly seemed to reflect the contradictions in her life, spaces filled with mementos of her success existing alongside the reality of being treated as if that success had never happened or worse, no longer mattered. The phone rang twice that evening, her friend Diana checking in after hearing nothing from Margaret all weekend, and her former business partner Thomas seeing if she'd considered his offer to join a new venture as an advisor. Both conversations were brief, Margaret unwilling to delve into the evening's humiliation or make decisions while emotions ran high. As darkness settled over Springfield, Margaret sat in her office chair and looked out at the garden she'd carefully tended, illuminated now by subtle landscape lighting. Somewhere across town, her son and his family were continuing their evening, perhaps already forgetting the dinner table tension, while she sat replaying each dismissive comment, each subtle erasure of her expertise and experience. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the strategic thinking that had been her professional hallmark. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about Vanessa systematically undermining not just their relationship but Margaret's relationship with her son and grandchildren. It was about the dangerous precedent being set for Emma and Noah, who were learning that experience could be dismissed, that knowledge had an expiration date, that treating family with respect was optional. Something needed to change. Not just for Margaret's sake, but for the entire family dynamic. She opened her laptop and began to research, a familiar activity that had always helped her process complex situations. The glow of the screen illuminated her features as she typed Apex Innovations into the search bar, followed by Simon Chen. Before tonight, She had deliberately maintained a respectful distance from Vanessa's professional world, careful not to intrude or appear to be monitoring her daughter-in-law's career. But that courtesy had not been reciprocated. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. As articles and profiles about Vanessa's company and her boss filled the screen, Margaret felt a strange sense of clarity emerging. This wasn't about competing with Vanessa or undermining her position. It was about reclaiming her own voice, her own expertise, her own right to exist as more than an inconvenient footnote in her son's life. The Digital Vanguard summit that Vanessa had mentioned caught her attention. A quick search revealed what she had suspected: Richard Kaufman wasn't merely on the advisory board, as Vanessa had dismissively suggested. He was the primary founder and had established the program specifically to connect emerging digital leaders with seasoned business veterans, believing that the intersection of new technology and proven business principles created the most innovative solutions. Margaret smiled slightly as she read the summit's mission statement: bridging generational business wisdom with technological innovation to create tomorrow's solutions. Richard was an old colleague, someone she had worked with on multiple projects before her retirement. They had maintained a friendly professional relationship over the years, occasionally meeting for lunch when he visited Springfield. She hadn't mentioned this connection to Vanessa, not out of secrecy but because her daughter-in-law had never expressed any interest in Margaret's professional network. She hesitated, her cursor hovering over Richard's contact information. Using this connection felt like crossing a line she had carefully maintained for 8 years. But Vanessa had already erased those lines with her behavior tonight, publicly dismissing Margaret's entire career and expertise as irrelevant. More importantly, Margaret realized as she stared at the screen, she wasn't contemplating this to hurt Vanessa or damage her career. Quite the opposite, she was considering whether her network and knowledge might actually benefit her daughter-in-law's company, if approached correctly. The product launch Vanessa had described at dinner had several concerning gaps that Margaret's experience could help address. The real question was whether she could find a way to contribute that wouldn't trigger Vanessa's defensiveness or create more family tension. Direct involvement seemed impossible given tonight's explicit rejection of her advice. But perhaps there were other channels, other ways to potentially help both Apex Innovations and, by extension, her son's family's financial security. Margaret closed her laptop without sending any messages. This required careful thought, not reactive action. Tomorrow, with a clearer head, she would consider her options. As she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself thinking about Emma's business project, a simple plan to sell homemade bookmarks to raise money for the school library. The entrepreneurial spirit her granddaughter was showing had filled Margaret with pride, and they had already spent several weekends discussing product design, pricing strategies, and marketing approaches at a level Emma could understand. It struck Margaret that her granddaughter valued her business knowledge more than Vanessa did, saw it as relevant and helpful rather than outdated and intrusive. There was a lesson in that somewhere, a reminder that wisdom didn't become obsolete just because technology evolved. Tomorrow would bring new perspectives and perhaps new approaches to the situation with Vanessa. For tonight, Margaret Wilson would sleep knowing that while she couldn't control how others perceived her value, she could control how she responded to those perceptions. And for the first time in 8 years of navigating her daughter-in-law's dismissive attitude, Margaret began to consider that her response might need to change dramatically. Not in anger or retaliation, but in a strategic realignment that would honor her own expertise while potentially creating unexpected benefits for everyone involved, whether Vanessa recognized those benefits or not. The rain continued to fall. Outside her window, a steady rhythm that eventually lulled her to sleep. Her last conscious thought was of something her own mentor had told her decades ago: true expertise doesn't demand recognition, it simply waits to be discovered by those wise enough to look for it. Somewhere across Springfield, Margaret suspected, Vanessa was still entirely unaware that her dismissal of her mother-in-law's business acumen might soon prove to be the most short-sighted professional assessment of her career. The sharp buzzing of her alarm pulled Margaret from a fitful sleep, though her mind had been alert long before the clock struck 6 a.m. The February rain had given way to unexpected sunshine that streamed through her bedroom windows, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that seemed at odds with her unsettled mood. For most of the night, her thoughts had circled around the dinner confrontation with Vanessa, examining it from every angle like a complex business problem requiring solution. By morning, something had crystallized within her, not a detailed plan yet, but a decision to stop accepting the narrative her daughter-in-law had created. Margaret moved through her morning routine with purpose, brewing her favorite dark roast coffee and settling at her kitchen island with her laptop. The modern, open-concept kitchen had been designed for both functionality and warmth, much like the business strategies she'd implemented throughout her career, practical but with a human touch that many of her competitors had overlooked. She opened her email and found a message from Thomas Barnes, her former business partner, following up on their brief conversation the night before. Margaret, the offer to join Vertex Consulting as senior advisor stands. Your insight into market transitions is sorely missed in this industry. The managing partners are meeting Thursday at 2 o'clock. Consider joining us? Thomas, she sipped her coffee thoughtfully. The timing of Thomas's renewed offer felt significant after last night's confrontation. For 8 years, she had turned down similar opportunities, scaling back her professional involvement to focus on family and personal interests. She'd wanted to give James and Vanessa space to build their careers without feeling her shadow, to be available for her grandchildren, to explore the post-retirement life she'd earned. But those choices had been interpreted not as generosity, but as confirmation of irrelevance. Perhaps it was time to reconsider. Before she could respond to Thomas, her phone rang with a familiar ringtone. Diana Carson had been her closest friend since they met at business school 30 years ago. Now heading her own financial consulting firm, Diana had never fully understood Margaret's decision to step back from the business world. I'm assuming from your tone last night that the family dinner went about as well as the Titanic's maiden voyage, Diana said without preamble when Margaret answered. Margaret laughed despite herself. That's actually optimistic. At least the Titanic had a few hours of smooth sailing before disaster. She recounted the previous evening's events, her voice steady even as she described Vanessa's public dismissal of her business knowledge. 8 years, Diana said when she finished. 8 years you've been walking on eggshells around this woman, and for what? So she can treat you like you're some outdated flip phone in a world of smartphones? That's a surprisingly accurate metaphor, Margaret admitted, moving to her office with her coffee. She actually used the phrase, outdated methods at one point. Outdated? Diana's indignation carried clearly through the phone. You literally wrote the handbook on transitional business strategies that half these tech companies still use without attribution. Your market prediction models are still being taught at Wharton. Just because you chose to retire doesn't mean your brain expired. According to Vanessa, it did. Margaret settled into her desk chair, her gaze falling on the awards that still lined her bookshelf, recognition from industry leaders that she'd never displayed prominently when Vanessa visited, not wanting to appear boastful. So what are you going to do about it? Diana's question was direct, as always. I'm still considering my options. Margaret's attention turned to her computer screen, where her search from the night before was still open, Simon Chen's professional profile at Apex Innovations. Well, consider quickly, Diana advised. Thomas told me about his offer. That's a prestigious position, and it would remind everyone, including your daughter-in-law, exactly who they're dismissing. After promising to meet Diana for lunch later in the week, Margaret ended the call and focused on her research. Simon Chen's profile revealed a career trajectory similar to her own, beginning in traditional business before recognizing the potential of emerging technologies. His leadership philosophy, quoted in several interviews, emphasized the importance of balancing innovation with proven business fundamentals. It was the exact approach Margaret had championed throughout her career, and precisely what seemed to be missing from Vanessa's strategy based on what she described at dinner. A new email notification appeared, from Emma, sent from her school account. Grandma, can you still help me with my bookmark business? Mom said maybe you're too busy with retired person stuff, but I really want your help. My presentation is next Friday. Love, Emma. The message tightened something in Margaret's chest. Retired person stuff, another dismissive characterization. This one apparently shared with her granddaughter. She typed a quick reply, assuring Emma that she would absolutely help and suggesting they work on it that weekend. As she sent the response, another notification appeared, a LinkedIn message from Richard Kaufman himself. Margaret, noticed someone with your profile was viewing information about the Digital Vanguard Summit. Are you considering a return to active consulting? We could certainly use your perspective on the advisory committee. Let's catch up soon. Richard, the coincidence was startling. She hadn't logged into LinkedIn or contacted Richard directly, the algorithm had simply noticed her search activity and alerted him that someone with her profile had shown interest. For a moment, Margaret sat very still, considering the implications. One simple search had created a potential opportunity, a direct line to the very program Vanessa had described as career-defining. It wasn't what Margaret had intended when she'd begun researching last night, but it represented a possibility she hadn't considered. Before she could overthink it, she replied to Richard, explaining that she wasn't looking to return to consulting but would enjoy catching up. Within minutes, he suggested a video call that very afternoon. The immediacy was surprising but not unwelcome. Margaret confirmed the appointment, then spent the next few hours reviewing Apex Innovations' public materials, particularly those related to the product launch Vanessa had discussed at dinner. What she found concerned her. The approach Vanessa had outlined reflected common pitfalls Margaret had seen destroy promising products: insufficient market testing, over-reliance on digital metrics without qualitative feedback, and a launch strategy that failed to account for supply chain vulnerabilities that were clearly visible in their industry. If executed as described, the launch could seriously damage Apex's market position and, by extension, Vanessa's career trajectory. The family implications were obvious: financial stress, increased work pressure, less time with the children. The thought of Emma and Noah suffering the consequences of a failed product strategy made Margaret's decision clearer. This wasn't about proving Vanessa wrong. It was about preventing a potential disaster that would affect her son and grandchildren. But how to help when her advice had been so explicitly rejected? At precisely 2 p.m., Richard Kaufman's face appeared on Margaret's screen, his familiar broad smile and silver-streaked beard as welcoming as ever. "Margaret Wilson," he said warmly. "Still looking like you could step into a boardroom and take over without missing a beat." She laughed, genuinely pleased to see her old colleague. "Flattery noted and appreciated, Richard. You're not exactly withering away yourself." They spent the first few minutes catching up on personal news: his recent marriage to a longtime companion, her delight in grandparenthood, mutual friends and former colleagues. But Richard had always been one to move efficiently to business matters. "So," he said finally, "what prompted your interest in the Digital Vanguard Summit? Thinking of joining us in an advisory capacity?" Margaret considered her words carefully. "Actually, my daughter-in-law was selected to attend. She's a director at Apex Innovations, Vanessa Wilson." Recognition flickered across Richard's face. "Ah yes, the marketing director. Simon Chen recommended her personally, speaks very highly of her innovative approach." "She's certainly innovative," Margaret agreed, choosing her words with precision. "Very focused on emerging digital strategies." Richard's expression shifted subtly, picking up on what Margaret wasn't saying. They'd worked together long enough for him to read between her careful phrasing. "But," he prompted. Margaret sighed. "This is complicated, Richard. Family dynamics are involved." "When aren't they?" he replied with a knowing smile. "Let me guess, she doesn't value your expertise. Because you're just her husband's mother and not a current industry player?" The accuracy of his assessment startled a laugh from Margaret. "Something like that." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, one reason I started the Digital Vanguard Summit was precisely because I saw too many promising young executives dismissing established business wisdom in their rush to embrace digital transformation. They're reinventing wheels and repeating mistakes that veterans like us learned to avoid decades ago." He paused, studying her through the screen. "You've reviewed Apex's current strategies, haven't you?" She nodded, not bothering to deny it. "Their upcoming product launch concerns me. The approach has significant vulnerabilities that could be easily addressed with some adjustments." "Let me take a wild guess, you've tried to mention these concerns. And been shut down?" Explicitly and publicly, Margaret confirmed, the sting of Vanessa's dinner table dismissal still fresh. Richard sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Simon Chen and I have a monthly lunch. He's been mentioning some concerns about their launch strategy but hasn't been able to pinpoint the specific issues. Their junior team is very technologically sophisticated but lacks experience with large-scale product rollouts." Margaret felt a flash of vindication but kept her expression neutral. "That matches my assessment." "Here's a thought," Richard said, his tone shifting to one she recognized from their strategy sessions years ago. "The summit is designed to connect seasoned business leaders with emerging digital talents. We pair each attendee with a mentor who can provide complementary expertise." He paused, watching her face. "Vanessa hasn't been assigned a mentor yet." The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her pulse quicken slightly at the direction the conversation was taking. "Richard, I'm not sure that would be appropriate. The family dynamics are complicated." "Who said anything about you being her mentor?" Richard's eyes twinkled with a familiar mischief that had often preceded their most successful business maneuvers. "But perhaps you might consider joining our advisory board. Your expertise in market transitions and product launches is precisely what we're looking to incorporate into the program." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And as an advisor, I might have input on the content presented to all participants, including Vanessa?" "Precisely," Richard confirmed. "You wouldn't be directly advising her, you'd be helping shape the curriculum that could address exactly the kind of launch vulnerabilities you've identified. If her company benefits from that wisdom, well, that's the entire purpose of the summit. It was an elegant solution, a way to potentially help without directly challenging Vanessa's rejection of her advice. Still, Margaret hesitated. What about Simon Chen? Wouldn't my involvement seem like an overreach into Vanessa's professional territory? Richard's response was immediate. Simon and I were just discussing last week how we needed someone with your exact background for the advisory committee. If I mention your name to him, I guarantee his response will be enthusiasm, not concern. The conversation continued for another half hour, with Richard outlining the specific responsibilities and time commitment involved. By the time they disconnected, Margaret had provisionally agreed to join the advisory board, pending a formal discussion with the full committee. The following week, as she closed her laptop, Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions: satisfaction at the potential to contribute meaningfully again, concern about how Vanessa might perceive her involvement, and a lingering sadness that such a roundabout approach was necessary to help her own family. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Mom, are you still good to take the kids this Saturday? Vanessa has a work emergency with the launch, and I have that client meeting I can't reschedule. The work emergency confirmed Margaret's concerns about the product launch difficulties. She quickly replied that she'd be happy to have Emma and Noah for the day, perhaps even overnight if that would help. James's relief was palpable even through text. That would be amazing. Vanessa's been stressed about this launch for weeks. It's not going as smoothly as she expected. Margaret set down her phone, her resolve strengthening. This wasn't about proving herself right or Vanessa wrong. It was about using her expertise to help prevent a business disaster that would impact her son's family, including her beloved grandchildren. If that meant working behind the scenes through the summit rather than offering direct advice, so be it. Saturday morning arrived with the cheerful chaos that always accompanied her grandchildren's visits. Emma bounded into Margaret's house with a backpack full of materials for her bookmark business, while Noah carried his favorite action figures and a half-completed Lego project. Grandma! Emma exclaimed, already pulling folders from her backpack. I've been thinking about our marketing strategy. What if we offer a discount if people buy 3 bookmarks instead of just 1? Margaret smiled, hanging up their coats, while James unloaded overnight bags from the car. That's called bundle pricing, and it's an excellent strategy. Let's work through the numbers and see what discount makes sense. See, Dad? Emma turned to James triumphantly. Grandma knows all the real business words for my ideas. James smiled, though Margaret caught the flash of something like regret in his eyes. Grandma knows more about business than most people I've ever met, he said, giving his daughter a quick hug. You're lucky to have her help. After James left, promising to pick them up the following afternoon, Margaret settled the children in their usual spaces, Noah in the family room with his Lego table, and Emma at the kitchen island that would serve as their business headquarters. Okay, CEO Emma, Margaret said, pulling out a notebook. Let's review your business plan and identify any areas we need to strengthen before your presentation. Emma beamed at the title and spread her materials across the counter, hand-designed bookmarks in various stages of completion, a price list written in careful 5th-grade handwriting, and a simple spreadsheet Margaret had helped her create to track costs and projected sales. Mom says my prices are too high, Emma said, pointing to the $2.50 figure she'd calculated based on materials and time. She says kids don't have that much money to spend. Margaret considered this carefully. Your mom might have a point about your target market's spending capacity. But before we adjust prices, let's talk about perceived value. Do you know what that means? Emma shook her head, leaning forward eagerly. It means what people think something is worth based on how it looks, how it's presented, and the story behind it, Margaret explained. If you reduce your prices but don't change anything else, people might think your bookmarks aren't as special. But if you create different tiers of products, maybe some simpler designs at lower prices and premium designs at your original price, you can capture different segments of your market. Emma's eyes widened with understanding. Like how stores have the fancy version of something and the regular version? Exactly, Margaret confirmed, impressed by her granddaughter's quick grasp of the concept. It's called product differentiation, and it's a strategy many successful businesses use. They spent the next 2 hours refining Emma's business plan, with Margaret explaining concepts like cost structure, value proposition, and target market in terms the 10-year-old could understand and apply. By lunchtime, they had developed a comprehensive strategy that included 3 product tiers, a social impact component, donating 1 bookmark to the school library for every 10 sold, and a clear marketing message that emphasized the handcrafted nature of the product. Grandma, Emma said as they prepared lunch for Noah, you make business stuff sound so interesting. Mom always talks about algorithms and engagement metrics and digital optimization. I don't understand half of what she says. Margaret handed Emma plates to set the table. Digital tools are incredibly important in today's business world, she said carefully, not wanting to undermine Vanessa. Your mom is an expert in those areas. But they're tools that serve fundamental business principles that haven't really changed. Understanding customer needs, creating value, managing resources efficiently, these basics remain consistent even as the methods evolve. That makes sense, Emma nodded thoughtfully. Like how we're using Instagram to show my bookmarks, but we still have to make bookmarks people actually want to buy. Precisely, Margaret smiled, once again impressed by her granddaughter's intuitive understanding. The platforms change, but the principles remain. After lunch, while the children were engrossed in a board game, Margaret's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Stepping into her office to answer, she was surprised to hear Simon Chen's voice. Mrs. Wilson? This is Simon Chen from Apex Innovations. Richard Kaufman suggested I call you directly. Margaret sat down at her desk, unprepared for this development. Mr. Chen, this is unexpected. How can I help you? Richard spoke very highly of your expertise in product launches and market transitions, Simon continued. He mentioned you might be joining the advisory board for the Digital Vanguard Summit. We've discussed that possibility, yes, Margaret confirmed cautiously. I'll be direct, Mrs. Wilson. We're facing some challenges with our upcoming product launch, issues that align precisely with the expertise Richard says you possess. He suggested you might be willing to review our strategy confidentially, perhaps provide some guidance. Margaret's mind raced. This was Vanessa's project, the very one she'd been explicitly told not to offer advice about. Yet here was Vanessa's boss, specifically seeking that advice without knowing the connection. Mr. Chen, she began carefully, I should mention that my daughter-in-law, Vanessa Wilson, is your marketing director. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. I was not aware of that connection, Simon finally said, his tone shifting slightly. That does complicate matters. Yes, it does, Margaret agreed. Vanessa is very protective of her professional territory, as she should be. I've been careful not to intrude on her work life. Simon seemed to consider this. I understand. However, the challenges we're facing could significantly impact the company's market position. Vanessa's team has developed an innovative product, but our launch strategy has vulnerabilities that I'm concerned about. Richard seemed to think you could identify and help address these issues quickly. The conversation had reached a crucial juncture. Margaret thought of Vanessa's dinner table dismissal, her explicit rejection of any business advice. She thought of James and the children, how a failed product launch might affect their family stability. She thought of the notebook still sitting on her desk, filled with preliminary observations about Apex's launch vulnerabilities that she'd compiled after her research. Mr. Chen, she said finally, I would be willing to review your launch strategy confidentially, with one condition. Name it, he replied immediately. Any insights I provide must be presented as coming from your own analysis or from the Summit Advisory Board collectively. Vanessa cannot know that I specifically was consulted. Absolutely, Simon agreed. Without hesitation. My priority is protecting the launch and, by extension, your daughter-in-law's project. If your insights help us succeed, everyone benefits, regardless of the source. They arranged for Simon to send the confidential launch materials to Margaret's secure email, with a follow-up call scheduled for Monday afternoon after she'd had time to review everything. As she ended the call, Margaret sat quietly at her desk, absorbing the unexpected turn of events. In less than a week, she had gone from being publicly dismissed by her daughter-in-law to being secretly consulted by her daughter-in-law's boss on the very project she'd been told to stay away from. The irony wasn't lost on her. But neither was the responsibility. This wasn't about vindication or proving Vanessa wrong. It was about using her expertise to prevent a potential business disaster that would affect multiple lives, including those of her son and grandchildren. From the family room, she heard Emma's delighted laugh as she apparently won the board game against her brother. The sound crystallized Margaret's resolve. She would review Apex's launch strategy thoroughly and provide the best guidance she could offer, regardless of Vanessa's dinner table dismissal. Sometimes, Margaret reflected as she rejoined her grandchildren, the most valuable advice came from unexpected sources, even from a retired mother-in-law with supposedly outdated business methods. Sunday evening found Margaret in her home office, surrounded by documents spread across her desk in a pattern that would have appeared chaotic to anyone else but represented a precise analytical system she'd refined over decades. Simon Chen had sent over 70 pages of confidential materials related to Apex Innovations' product launch, market analyses, production timelines, distribution strategies, and promotional plans that collectively painted a concerning picture. The children were asleep in their rooms upstairs, exhausted from a day of activities that had culminated in a backyard astronomy session, searching for constellations with the telescope Margaret had purchased specifically for their visits. Now, in the quiet hours, she could focus entirely on identifying the critical flaws in Vanessa's launch strategy. Margaret sipped her tea and made another notation in the margins of the distribution timeline. The vulnerabilities were even more significant than she'd initially suspected. Apex had developed a genuinely innovative smart home security system that integrated with existing devices using proprietary technology. The product itself was excellent, perhaps even revolutionary. But the launch strategy contained three critical flaws that threatened to undermine its market entry. First, the pricing structure failed to account for consumer psychology in the security market, setting initial price points that would trigger comparison with established competitors rather than positioning the product in its own category. Second, the distribution timeline ignored seasonal manufacturing constraints in the Asian markets where key components were sourced, creating a high probability of inventory shortages precisely when marketing efforts would generate peak demand. Third, and most concerning, the customer acquisition strategy relied heavily on digital channels while underutilizing Apex's existing relationships with home builders and security installers, relationships that could provide immediate credibility in a market where trust was paramount. Margaret sat back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. These weren't minor issues, they were fundamental strategic flaws that could sink an otherwise promising product. And based on the meeting notes Simon had included, Vanessa's team was accelerating toward launch without addressing any of these vulnerabilities. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The very outdated business methods Vanessa had dismissed at the dinner table would have identified these issues immediately. Digital transformation had changed the tools of business but not the fundamental principles of market entry, supply chain management, or consumer psychology that Margaret had mastered over her career. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Everything okay with the kids? Vanessa working late again on launch. Thanks for keeping them overnight." Margaret replied quickly, assuring him that Emma and Noah were sleeping peacefully and could stay as long as needed tomorrow. She didn't mention that she was currently reviewing the very project keeping their mother working late on a Sunday. She returned to the documents, meticulously crafting a detailed analysis that identified each vulnerability and provided specific, actionable recommendations for addressing them. By midnight, she had compiled a comprehensive 15-page report that maintained a respectful, constructive tone throughout, focusing on strengthening the strategy rather than criticizing its creators. After saving the document, Margaret closed her laptop and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The ethical complexity of her situation wasn't lost on her. She was secretly intervening in her daughter-in-law's professional project after being explicitly told to keep her business advice to herself. Yet allowing the launch to proceed with its current flaws would harm not only Apex Innovations but potentially Vanessa's career and, by extension, her son's family. "Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one," she murmured to herself, a phrase she'd often used when mentoring younger executives through difficult decisions. Monday morning arrived with the cheerful chaos of getting 2 children fed and ready for school. James arrived earlier than expected, looking tired but grateful. "Vanessa sends her thanks," he said as the children gathered their belongings. "She's in emergency meetings all day. The launch has hit some complications." Margaret nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite knowing exactly what those complications entailed. "Happy to help anytime. Emma and I made good progress on her business project, too." Emma beamed, throwing her arms around Margaret. "Grandma taught me about product differentiation and value propositions. My presentation is going to be amazing." James raised an eyebrow, looking impressed. "That sounds more advanced than what I learned in my college business classes." "Grandma makes it easy to understand," Emma said confidently. "She doesn't use confusing words like Mom does when she talks about work." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed James's face, but he simply smiled and ushered the children toward the door. "We should get going. Thanks again, Mom. I'll call you later." After they left, Margaret prepared for her 2 p.m. call with Simon Chen, reviewing her analysis one more time to ensure it was both comprehensive and diplomatic. When her phone rang precisely at 2, she answered with the same professional composure she'd maintained in countless executive meetings throughout her career. "Mrs. Wilson," Simon began, his tone reflecting both respect and urgency, "I've reviewed your preliminary notes. Your assessment of our vulnerabilities is remarkably accurate." "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I've completed a more detailed analysis with specific recommendations for addressing each issue." She had deliberately not sent the full report in advance, preferring to discuss it live to gauge his receptiveness. "I'd be grateful to hear them," Simon replied. We're facing significant pressure from investors regarding the launch timeline, but I've had growing concerns about our readiness. Over the next hour, Margaret walked him through each vulnerability and her proposed solutions, careful to frame everything in terms of strengthening an already innovative product rather than correcting mistakes. Simon's responses grew increasingly enthusiastic as he recognized the practical wisdom in her approach. "This is exactly what we've been missing," he said finally. "The technical team has created an exceptional product, but our go-to-market strategy hasn't received the same rigorous analysis. Your recommendations address precisely the gaps I've been unable to articulate to the team." "I'm glad you find them helpful," Margaret replied, maintaining her professional distance despite her internal satisfaction. "More than helpful, potentially game-changing," Simon continued. "The question now is implementation. Our marketing director, your daughter-in-law, as you mentioned, has been driving this launch with considerable investment of time and reputation. These changes, while necessary, will need to be introduced carefully." This was the delicate part of the equation. Margaret chose her words with precision. "Perhaps the recommendations could be presented as insights from the Digital Vanguard Summit's preparatory materials?" Richard mentioned that addressing product launch vulnerabilities is part of this year's curriculum. Simon was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the suggestion. "That could work. Vanessa is eager to make a strong impression at the summit. If these recommendations were presented as advanced strategies from the program's advisory board, she might be more receptive." "Precisely," Margaret agreed. "The summit is designed to connect emerging leaders with established business wisdom. This would simply be an early application of that principle." By the end of the call, they had agreed on a path forward. Simon would introduce the key recommendations at the next day's executive meeting, presenting them as insights from his ongoing discussions with the Digital Vanguard Summit organizers, technically true, though intentionally vague about the specific source. Margaret would formally join the summit's advisory board, focusing on developing curriculum materials around product launches and market transitions, materials that would conveniently align with the recommendations she'd just provided to Apex. As she ended the call, Margaret felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern. She had potentially helped save an important product launch and, by extension, her daughter-in-law's professional reputation. But she had done so through channels that Vanessa would likely see as an intrusion if she ever discovered the truth. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret officially accepted the advisory position with the Digital Vanguard Summit, participating in virtual meetings with Richard and the other committee members to begin shaping the curriculum. Her proposed focus on integrating traditional market entry principles with digital transformation was enthusiastically approved, with Richard giving her considerable latitude to develop the content. Meanwhile, she heard nothing directly from James or Vanessa about the Apex launch, though Diana, who had connections throughout the business community, reported hearing rumors of a significant strategy shift that had impressed several key investors. Whatever crisis they were heading toward seems to have been averted, Diana told her over lunch on Thursday. "The buzz now is all about their innovative dual-channel approach to market entry." "Sound familiar?" Margaret simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying her involvement. The dual-channel approach had been one of her key recommendations, leveraging both digital marketing and traditional installer networks simultaneously rather than sequentially. On Friday afternoon, as Margaret was reviewing Emma's final presentation materials for her school project, her phone rang with James's number. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice carrying an unusual mix of emotions, "are you free for dinner tonight? Just you and me?" The request was unexpected. James rarely arranged one-on-one dinners, generally including either Vanessa or the children in their plans. "Of course," she replied, curious about the purpose. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he assured her quickly. "There's just something I'd like to discuss. Could we meet at Giuseppe's at 7? Giuseppe's was one of their longtime favorite restaurants, a place they'd gone for special conversations throughout James's life, from his college selection discussions to his decision to propose to Vanessa. Whatever he wanted to talk about, it was significant. "I'll be there," Margaret promised, her mind already cycling through possibilities as she hung up. Giuseppe's hadn't changed much over the decades. The same warm lighting, red checkered tablecloths, and family photos lining the walls created an atmosphere of comfortable intimacy perfect for important conversations. James was already seated at their usual corner table when Margaret arrived, a glass of wine in front of him and a familiar pensive expression on his face. He stood to embrace her, holding the hug a moment longer than usual. "Thanks for coming, Mom." "Of course," she replied, studying his face as they sat down. "What's on your mind?" James took a sip of his wine, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Something interesting happened at Apex this week. Vanessa's product launch was headed for serious problems, distribution issues, pricing strategy flaws, some fundamental miscalculations that could have been disastrous. Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart rate quickened slightly. That sounds concerning. It was, James confirmed. But then Simon Chen, Vanessa's boss, came to an executive meeting with a complete strategic overhaul. Said he'd been consulting with the Digital Vanguard Summit Advisory Board about launch vulnerabilities and had developed specific recommendations to address the exact issues they were facing. He paused, watching her face carefully. The interesting part is that these recommendations sounded remarkably familiar to me. Almost as if I'd heard someone discussing similar principles over family dinners for years. Margaret took a deliberate sip of the water the server had placed before her. Business fundamentals tend to be consistent across industries and eras, she offered non-committally. James leaned forward slightly. Mom, are you by any chance involved with the Digital Vanguard Summit? The directness of the question surprised her. Margaret considered deflecting but decided honesty was the better approach, at least partial honesty. I recently joined their advisory board, yes. Richard Kaufman is an old colleague who invited me to participate. James nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. And did you happen to provide any input on product launch strategies that might have made their way to Simon Chen? Margaret met her son's gaze directly. James, you know I would never deliberately interfere in Vanessa's professional life. She made it very clear that my business advice is unwelcome. That's not a denial, James observed quietly. Margaret sighed. The advisory board is developing curriculum materials on various business topics. Product launches and market transitions happen to be areas where I have considerable expertise. If some of those general principles were shared with summit participants, or partners like Simon, that would be the entire purpose of the program. James was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. You know what's strange? Vanessa has been walking around the house for the past 2 days talking about these revolutionary insights from the summit that saved their launch. She's implementing strategies that sound exactly like what you tried to discuss at dinner last week, the dinner where she shut you down completely. The irony hung in the air between them. Margaret waited, letting James process the situation in his own way. She has no idea, does she? He finally asked. That the advice she rejected from her mother-in-law is essentially the same advice. She's now enthusiastically embracing because it came through her boss? And it should stay that way, Margaret said firmly. This isn't about who gets credit, James. It's about a successful product launch that benefits Apex, its employees, and ultimately your family. James shook his head, a mix of admiration and frustration crossing his features. You found a way to help her despite her rejection. To give her exactly what she needed without triggering her defensiveness or challenging her pride. I found a way to support my family, Margaret corrected gently. Your success and happiness have always been my priority, and that now extends to Emma and Noah. If helping Vanessa succeed professionally contributes to family stability and prosperity, then that's what matters, not who gets credit or acknowledgement. But it's not fair, James protested, surprising her with the sudden emotion in his voice. For 8 years, I've watched her dismiss your expertise, minimize your accomplishments, and treat your business success as if it were some quaint historical footnote rather than the remarkable achievement it was. And now she's implementing your strategies while talking about how cutting-edge and innovative they are. Margaret reached across the table to cover her son's hand with her own. Life rarely distributes fairness evenly, James. You know that. I made a choice 8 years ago to prioritize family harmony over professional recognition. That choice has allowed me to be part of Emma and Noah's lives in a meaningful way. I don't regret it. But you deserved better, James insisted. You deserved respect for what you accomplished, for the wisdom you accumulated. Instead, you've been treated like a retired mother-in-law whose only value is in babysitting and holiday cooking. Margaret finished with a small smile. Perhaps. But that perception allowed me the freedom to build relationships with my grandchildren without constant professional competition or comparison. There's value in that too. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their meals, the same dishes they'd been ordering for years. As they began eating, James seemed to be working through something in his mind. You know, he said finally, Emma talks about you differently lately. After your help with her business project, she told me you understand how to explain complicated things simply. She said you make her feel smart rather than confused. Margaret felt a surge of warmth at the description. Emma has a natural aptitude for business concepts. She just needed them translated into terms that connect with her experience. That's exactly what Vanessa said about Simon's new launch strategy, James said with a hint of irony. That he finally explained the traditional business principles in ways that connected with digital transformation opportunities. Margaret couldn't help but laugh softly at the parallel. Perhaps there's a lesson there about how wisdom can be transmitted effectively across generations, whether in fifth-grade business projects or corporate product launches. They continued their dinner, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: Noah's latest science fascination, James's current architectural project, community news. But as they prepared to leave, James returned to the subject that had prompted their meeting. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that I recognize what you did and why you did it. Finding a way to help without taking credit, to contribute. Your wisdom without challenging Vanessa's position, that takes a special kind of generosity." Margaret gathered her purse, touched by her son's understanding. "It's what mothers do, James. We find ways to help our children succeed, even when they don't recognize they need our help. The joy is in seeing the success, not in receiving the acknowledgement." Outside the restaurant, as they prepared to go their separate ways, James embraced her tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not just for helping with the launch, but for showing me what true leadership looks like. It's not about recognition or credit, it's about making others successful even when they don't see your contribution." As Margaret drove home through the quiet streets of Springfield, she reflected on the unexpected path her retirement had taken. She had stepped back from the business world to focus on family, only to find herself secretly applying her expertise to save her daughter-in-law's product launch. The situation contained layers of irony that might have been bitter had she allowed them to be. But Margaret had long ago learned that bitterness was a poor investment of emotional energy. Better to channel that energy into constructive action, even if that action remained largely invisible to its beneficiaries. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard Kaufman. "Advisory board meeting next Tuesday will include several Apex executives, including your daughter-in-law. Simon wants them to hear directly from the summit faculty. Potentially awkward for you?" Margaret smiled slightly as she pulled into her driveway. "Not awkward at all," she typed back. "I'll focus on general principles rather than specific applications. The goal is successful implementation, not personal recognition." As she entered her home, Margaret noticed Emma had left her business presentation materials on the kitchen counter with a note: "Thanks for all your help, Grandma. Miss Thompson says my business plan is the most professional she's ever seen from a student. Love you." The simple acknowledgement warmed Margaret more than any corporate award ever had. This was success measured not in market share or profit margins but in a child's confidence and gratitude, a different kind of legacy than the one she'd initially envisioned for herself, but no less valuable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she balanced her growing role with the Summit Advisory Board against the complex family dynamics with Vanessa. But tonight, Margaret Wilson would sleep peacefully, knowing that her decades of business wisdom were still creating value, both in her granddaughter's school project and in her daughter-in-law's product launch, whether that contribution was recognized or not. True expertise, she reflected as she prepared for bed, didn't require constant validation. It simply continued to function effectively, creating positive outcomes regardless of who received the credit. There was a profound freedom in that realization, a freedom that allowed her to help others succeed without needing to be acknowledged as the source of that success. And perhaps that was the most valuable business lesson of all, one she hoped both Emma and Vanessa might eventually understand. The gleaming headquarters of Apex Innovations rose 15 stories above downtown Springfield, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sunlight like a beacon of modern business ambition. Margaret stood in the spacious lobby, her reflection in the polished marble floors appearing as composed and professional as she had in corporate settings for decades before her retirement. Today marked a significant milestone, her first official appearance as a Digital Vanguard Summit Advisory Board member at the pre-summit executive briefing. The fact that this briefing was being hosted at Apex, with Vanessa among the attendees, added layers of complexity to an already delicate situation. "Margaret Wilson." Richard Kaufman's booming voice carried across the lobby as he approached, arms outstretched in greeting. His genuine warmth had always been one of his greatest business assets, putting even the most guarded executives at ease. Perfect timing, as always. They embraced briefly, the familiarity of old colleagues evident in their interaction. "The conference room is ready upstairs," Richard continued, guiding her toward the elevators. "Simon has assembled quite a group, their entire executive team plus the product launch leaders. Your daughter-in-law included, of course." Margaret nodded, her expression revealing nothing of her internal thoughts. "I've reviewed the presentation materials. I think we've struck the right balance between general principles and practical applications." Diplomatic as ever, Richard chuckled as they entered the elevator. "Though I still think there's a certain poetic justice in you teaching Launch strategy to someone who explicitly rejected your advice on exactly that topic. This isn't about justice, poetic or otherwise, Margaret reminded him quietly. It's about successful knowledge transfer between generations of business leaders. Whether Vanessa realizes the source of that knowledge is irrelevant to its value. Richard studied her for a moment as the elevator ascended. You know, that perspective is precisely why we needed you on the advisory board. Too many experienced executives can't separate their ego from their expertise. They need credit, acknowledgement, validation. You've always understood that true influence often happens invisibly. The observation was perceptive, touching on something Margaret had come to understand only gradually throughout her career. Her most significant impacts had often come not through public presentations or official directives but through quiet conversations, thoughtful questions, and strategic suggestions that allowed others to reach their own conclusions. She had carefully guided them toward. The elevator doors opened to reveal Apex's executive floor, where Simon Chen was waiting to greet them. His handshake was firm, his expression reflecting both professional courtesy and genuine respect. Mrs. Wilson, thank you for coming today. The changes we implemented based on he caught himself, glancing around the busy hallway, based on the summit's preliminary insights have completely transformed our launch trajectory. Our pre-orders have exceeded projections by 47% since we adjusted our strategy. Margaret accepted the acknowledgement with a gracious nod. I'm glad to hear the principles are proving effective. Today's session should provide even more detailed applications specifically relevant to your industry. Simon led them toward a large conference room at the end of the hallway, its glass walls revealing approximately 20 people already seated around a polished oval table. Margaret spotted Vanessa immediately, her sleek dark hair pulled back. In a professional chignon, her expression animated as she discussed something with a colleague beside her. Just to confirm, Simon said quietly as they approached the room, we're maintaining the agreed narrative? The recommendations came through summit materials and my discussions with the advisory board collectively? Absolutely, Margaret assured him. Today's presentation will focus entirely on principles and applications, not on specific individuals who contributed to their development. As they entered the conference room, conversations quieted and attention shifted to the new arrivals. Simon made brief introductions, presenting Richard as the summit founder and Margaret as one of our most distinguished advisory board members, with extensive expertise in market transitions and product launches. Margaret watched Vanessa's expression as the introduction landed. The initial polite interest transformed into stunned recognition, then carefully controlled neutrality as professional training kicked in. Their eyes met briefly across the room, Vanessa's widening slightly before she looked away, focusing intently on her tablet screen. The moment passed quickly as Simon directed everyone to their seats and the meeting began. Richard opened with an overview of the summit's history and mission, emphasizing the integration of traditional business wisdom with emerging technological opportunities. As he spoke, Margaret observed the room dynamics, noting which executives appeared genuinely engaged and which were simply going through professional motions. Vanessa remained perfectly still throughout Richard's introduction, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. The only indication of her internal state was a slight whitening of her knuckles as she gripped her pen. When Richard introduced Margaret as the lead presenter for the product launch strategy session, a subtle ripple of reaction moved through the room, executives shifting forward in their seats, interest piqued by her impressive bio as it appeared on the screen behind her. Margaret moved to the front with the same confident grace that had carried her through countless corporate presentations. Her voice, when she began speaking, held the perfect balance of authority and accessibility, a skill she'd honed over decades of addressing diverse business audiences. The most successful product launches in today's market, she began, aren't those that choose between traditional principles and digital innovation. They're the ones that strategically integrate both, creating hybrid approaches that leverage established consumer psychology alongside emerging technological opportunities. For the next 45 minutes, Margaret led the group through a masterclass in product launch strategy, drawing on case studies and research that spanned both traditional and digital business environments. Without directly referencing Apex's specific strategy, she addressed precisely the vulnerabilities she had identified in their original plan and illustrated the principles behind the recommendations she had provided through Simon. Throughout her presentation, she was acutely aware of Vanessa's eyes on her, initially wary, then increasingly intent as the relevance and value of the content became undeniable. By the time Margaret opened the floor for questions, Vanessa's expression had transformed from guarded skepticism to reluctant interest, her tablet now filled with notes. The Q&A session was robust, with executives from various departments seeking clarification or additional insights on specific aspects of the strategy. Margaret addressed each question with the ease of someone who had considered these issues from every possible angle, providing actionable guidance without dictating specific solutions. When Vanessa finally raised her hand to ask a question, a subtle tension descended on the room. Those who knew of the family connection, Simon and Richard, at minimum, watched with particular interest. Mrs. Wilson, Vanessa began, her voice carefully professional, you mentioned the importance of timing secondary market entries to coincide with primary market feedback incorporation. Could you elaborate on how that principle applies when the feedback cycles are accelerated by digital channels? It was a thoughtful question, one that demonstrated both Vanessa's digital expertise and her genuine engagement with the material Margaret had presented. Margaret recognized it as an opportunity to model the very knowledge integration she had been advocating. Excellent question, she replied with genuine appreciation. Digital feedback channels have indeed compressed traditional market response cycles, which creates both opportunities and potential pitfalls in secondary market entry timing. She proceeded to build a nuanced response that validated Vanessa's digital expertise while extending it with traditional market principles that added crucial depth to the approach. As she spoke, Margaret could see Vanessa taking notes, her expression shifting from professional interest to something more, a reluctant recognition that there was valuable wisdom being offered, regardless of its source. When the formal presentation concluded, Richard and Simon invited everyone to a networking lunch in the adjacent room. As people began to move, Margaret found herself approached by several Apex executives eager to continue specific discussions. She engaged with each one attentively, careful to include nearby colleagues in the conversations rather than creating exclusive interactions. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Vanessa standing slightly apart, watching these interactions. With an expression that mingled professional assessment with personal conflict. When their eyes met briefly across the room, Vanessa quickly looked away, turning to engage with a colleague. Quite a successful session, Richard commented, joining Margaret as the room gradually emptied. Your presentation was perfectly calibrated, substantive. Without being prescriptive, authoritative without being intimidating. Exactly what we needed. Thank you, Margaret replied, gathering her materials. The engagement was encouraging. I think several of the executives recognized applications specific to their current challenges. Including your daughter-in-law, Richard observed quietly. Though she seems to be processing some complex emotions about the situation. Before Margaret could respond, Simon approached with evident enthusiasm. Mrs. Wilson, that was extraordinary. Several of my team members have already asked if you might be available for follow-up consultations specific to their departments. I'd be happy to provide additional guidance through the summit program, Margaret replied carefully, maintaining the professional boundaries they had established. Simon nodded, understanding her meaning. Of course. We'll coordinate through the proper channels. He glanced toward the networking lunch where Vanessa was visible in conversation with other executives. Today has been illuminating for everyone involved. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected sources. The observation hung in the air, laden with meaning beyond its surface. Margaret acknowledged it with a simple nod, her expression giving away nothing of her thoughts about the complex dynamics at play. As the day progressed through the networking lunch and follow-up sessions, Margaret maintained her professional focus, engaging thoughtfully with each executive who sought her input. Vanessa remained distantly polite, participating actively in group discussions but never directly engaging with her mother-in-law one-on-one. By late afternoon, as the event began winding down, Margaret found herself alone in the conference room, collecting her notes while the remaining attendees continued networking in the adjacent space. The quiet moment of solitude was welcome after hours of careful navigation through the professional and personal complexities of the situation. I didn't know you were on the advisory board. Margaret looked up to find Vanessa standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her posture rigidly controlled. It's a recent appointment, Margaret replied evenly, neither defensive nor apologetic. Richard reached out a few weeks ago. Vanessa stepped into the room, letting the door close behind her. Richard Kaufman. Who apparently is an old colleague of yours, something you never mentioned during all those times you heard me talking about the summit. The accusation was subtle but clear, you deliberately withheld information that would have been relevant to me professionally. You've never expressed interest in my professional connections, Vanessa, Margaret pointed out gently. When business topics arise, you've generally made it clear that my experience isn't relevant to your current challenges. The observation landed with visible impact. Vanessa's carefully composed expression faltered slightly, a flash of something, recognition, perhaps, or discomfort, crossing her features before she regained control. Your presentation today, she said after a moment, changing direction. It addressed exactly the issues we've been struggling with in our launch strategy. The same issues that Simon suddenly had solutions for last week. It wasn't quite a question, but the implication was clear. Margaret considered her response carefully, recognizing the delicacy of the moment. The summit's advisory board collaborates on developing materials that address common challenges in today's business environment, she said finally. Simon has been in communication with several board members about your launch. Including you? Vanessa pressed, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Margaret met her gaze directly. Vanessa, you made it explicitly clear at our family dinner that my business advice was unwelcome. I've respected that boundary. That's not a denial, Vanessa observed, the same words James had used at their dinner days earlier. No, Margaret acknowledged quietly. It's not. The admission hung in the air between them, neither woman willing to be the first to break the tension it created. Through the glass walls, they could see the networking event continuing, executives engaged in animated conversations, oblivious to the charged exchange taking place in the conference room. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice carrying a complexity of emotions beneath its professional tone. The changes we implemented based on Simon's recommendations have completely transformed our launch trajectory. We're now projecting first-year sales 40% above our original forecasts. Margaret nodded but remained silent, allowing Vanessa to navigate the conversation at her own pace. Those recommendations, Vanessa continued, choosing her words with evident care, were remarkably comprehensive. They addressed vulnerabilities that weren't obvious to digital natives but would be immediately apparent to someone with extensive experience in traditional market entries. Again, Margaret simply nodded, neither claiming credit nor deflecting the implicit acknowledgement. Someone like you, Vanessa concluded, the words carrying a weight beyond their simplicity. Experience has certain advantages, Margaret replied softly. Just as innovative digital approaches have theirs. The most effective strategies generally incorporate both perspectives. Vanessa moved to the window, looking out at the Springfield skyline as she processed this response. When she turned back, her expression had shifted subtly, still guarded but with something new emerging beneath the professional veneer. Why didn't you just say, "I told you so," she asked suddenly. You had the perfect opportunity, both when Simon implemented your recommendations and again today when I asked my question. You could have made it clear that these outdated methods I dismissed were exactly what saved our launch. The question revealed more about Vanessa's own thought patterns than she perhaps realized, an assumption that professional interactions were inherently competitive, that knowledge was a weapon to be wielded for personal validation rather than collective success. What would that have accomplished? Margaret asked simply. Would it have improved the launch outcomes? Would it have enhanced our family relationships? Would it have benefited Emma and Noah to see their grandmother and mother locked in a competition for professional validation? Vanessa seemed startled by this perspective, as if the questions illuminated an approach she hadn't considered. Most people would want the credit, she said finally. Especially after being publicly dismissed. I'm not most people, Margaret replied with a small smile. And at this stage of my life, I've learned that impact matters more than acknowledgement. Your launch is succeeding. The company is projected to exceed its targets. My son's family benefits from that success. Those outcomes matter far more than who gets credit for the strategy behind them. For the first time in their 8-year relationship, Vanessa seemed to be truly seeing Margaret, not as an outdated mother-in-law or a competitive threat, but as a professional with depth and wisdom she hadn't bothered to recognize. Emma keeps talking about the business principles you taught her, Vanessa said, shifting topics in a way that seemed meaningful. Value propositions, market segmentation, differentiated pricing strategies. She explains them more clearly than some of my MBA colleagues. Emma has a natural aptitude for business concepts, Margaret replied, echoing what she'd told James. She just needed them framed in terms that connected to her experience. The same could be said for me, apparently, Vanessa acknowledged with unexpected candor. The principles you presented today weren't new, they were foundations I learned in business school. But I dismissed them as outdated, irrelevant to digital transformation. I couldn't see how they still applied until they were framed in context with current challenges. The admission represented a significant shift, perhaps the first crack in the wall Vanessa had built between them over 8 years. Wisdom isn't linear, Margaret offered gently. It doesn't expire or become obsolete. It evolves, incorporates new information, adapts to changing environments. The most valuable insights often come from integrating seemingly contradictory perspectives, traditional and innovative, established and emerging, experienced and fresh. Vanessa considered this, her expression thoughtful. Like how our launch Strategy now incorporates both digital acquisition channels and traditional installer networks. Neither approach alone would have been as effective as the integrated strategy. Precisely, Margaret nodded, pleased by the parallel. The same principle applies to business knowledge across generations. Your digital expertise combined with traditional market entry principles creates a more robust approach than either perspective in isolation. Something shifted in Vanessa's demeanor, a subtle relaxing of her defensive posture, a softening around her eyes. I should get back to the networking event, she said finally. But I appreciate the insights you shared today. They were valuable. Coming from Vanessa, this simple acknowledgement represented a breakthrough moment, perhaps the first time she had directly expressed appreciation for Margaret's professional contribution. Thank you, Margaret replied, keeping her response measured despite the significance of the moment. I'm glad they were useful. As Vanessa turned to leave, she paused at the door. James mentioned you're helping Emma with her school presentation tomorrow. Would it be alright if I joined you? Maybe I could learn something from both of you. The request, tentative, almost vulnerable, caught Margaret by surprise. Of course, she managed, concealing her astonishment behind a warm smile. Emma would love that. So would I. Vanessa nodded once, a quick, decisive gesture, then rejoined the networking event without further comment. Through the glass walls, Margaret watched as she seamlessly integrated back into a group of executives, her professional persona firmly in place. Richard approached as Margaret gathered the last of her materials, his expression curious. Interesting conversation? A beginning, Margaret replied, unwilling to share the personal details of the exchange. Some professional recognition, at minimum. Progress, Richard nodded approvingly. Though I still think you deserve more explicit acknowledgement for saving their launch. Margaret closed her portfolio with a definitive click. What I deserve and what I need are different things, Richard. The launch is succeeding. The company is benefiting. And perhaps most importantly, a door that's been closed for 8 years may be starting to open, not because I demanded recognition, but because I prioritized impact over ego. As they left the Apex building together, Richard shook his head. With admiring disbelief. You know, most executives spend their entire careers trying to ensure they get credit for their contributions. You've spent yours ensuring that your contributions matter, regardless of who gets the credit. Different definitions of success, Margaret suggested as they reached the parking structure. Mine just happens to allow for better sleep at night. The following afternoon found Margaret in her kitchen with Emma, reviewing her final presentation materials one last time before Monday's school event. The 5th grader had embraced her bookmark business with remarkable enthusiasm, applying the principles Margaret had taught her with an intuitive understanding that belied her age. So I'll start with my value proposition, Emma was explaining, pointing to her carefully prepared note cards, then show my product tiers with the different price points, and explain how my social impact component works, the donation program. For the school library. Perfect sequencing, Margaret approved. You've structured it exactly right to build interest and engagement before revealing your social mission. The doorbell rang, interrupting their review. Emma ran to answer it, returning moments later with Vanessa, dressed more casually than Margaret had seen her in months, in jeans and a simple sweater rather than her usual professional attire. Mom! Emma exclaimed with evident surprise. Grandma and I are finalizing my presentation. Want to see? Actually, Vanessa replied. With a quick glance toward Margaret, I thought maybe I could help too. If that's okay with both of you. The careful neutrality in her voice suggested she was well aware of the unprecedented nature of this request, not just to join an activity she had previously dismissed as retired person stuff, but to position herself as a learner alongside her daughter rather than the authoritative expert she typically presented herself to be. That would be wonderful, Margaret said warmly, recognizing both the effort and vulnerability the gesture represented. Emma was just walking through her presentation structure. For the next hour, the 3 generations worked together on Emma's project, with Margaret guiding the overall strategy while Vanessa contributed insights on design elements and presentation techniques. Emma absorbed both perspectives with enthusiasm, clearly delighted to have both her mother and grandmother engaged in her project. You know, Vanessa said during a break as Emma went to retrieve something from her backpack, she explains these concepts more clearly than some of my team members. Value proposition, differentiated pricing, market segmentation, she really understands the fundamentals. She has good teachers, Margaret replied simply, including Vanessa in the acknowledgement. Vanessa accepted this with a small nod, then hesitated before continuing in a lower voice. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about impact mattering more than acknowledgement. I'm not sure I could have done what you did, help save our launch without demanding credit, especially after how I treated you at dinner. Margaret considered her response carefully. It's a perspective that comes with time and experience. At this stage of my life, I measure success differently than I did at your age. Family harmony and long-term relationships matter more than professional validation. Still, Vanessa persisted, I owe you an apology. Not just for the dinner, but for 8 years of dismissing your expertise and experience as irrelevant. That was short-sighted of me. The acknowledgement, offered without qualification or excuse, represented perhaps the most significant breakthrough in their relationship since James and Vanessa had married. Apology accepted, Margaret said. Simply, recognizing the courage it had taken for someone as proud as Vanessa to offer such a direct admission. And perhaps we can both learn something from Emma's approach. She naturally integrates traditional business wisdom with innovative applications, never questioning whether one invalidates the other. Emma returned with her sample bookmarks, interrupting the moment but creating a new one as the three of them turned their attention back to her project. For the first time in 8 years, they were working together rather than circling each other with careful distance or subtle competition. As the afternoon progressed into evening and James arrived to find the three of them laughing together over dinner preparations, Margaret caught his expression of stunned disbelief followed by cautious hope. Whatever had been set in motion by her invisible intervention in Vanessa's professional crisis was creating ripples far beyond the product launch, ripples that might eventually transform the entire family dynamic. Later, as Vanessa and James prepared to leave with the children, Vanessa paused at the door while James helped Emma and Noah into the car. I've been invited to present our launch strategy at the main Digital Vanguard Summit next month, she said, her tone carefully casual. Given how well the integrated approach is working, I thought, maybe you might be willing to review my presentation materials? Provide some feedback before I finalize them? The request represented a complete reversal of her previous stance on Margaret's business advice, not just a reluctant acceptance but an active solicitation of her input. I'd be happy to, Margaret replied, keeping her tone equally casual despite recognizing the significance of the moment. Perhaps we could review them together over lunch next week? My treat. I'd like that, Vanessa nodded, then added with the ghost of a smile, though fair warning, I might actually listen to your advice this time. As Margaret watched them drive away, she reflected on the strange, circular journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun with a painful rejection at a family dinner had transformed into a professional collaboration and the first genuine opening in their personal relationship, all because she had found a way to give her advice to Vanessa's boss instead of directly to Vanessa herself. The path hadn't been direct or easy, and the relationship still had considerable ground to cover before it could be called warm or close. But a door had opened, a possibility existed where none had seemed possible before. Sometimes, Margaret reflected as she closed her front door, the most effective advice finds its way to those who need it through unexpected channels. And sometimes the most valuable victories are the ones no one else even realizes you've won, the quiet triumphs of patience, strategic thinking, and prioritizing impact over acknowledgement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to bridge the generational gap between traditional wisdom and digital innovation. But tonight, Margaret Wilson would sleep peacefully, knowing that her decades of business experience were still creating value, both in her granddaughter's school project and in her daughter-in-law's professional success, and finally, perhaps, beginning to be recognized for their worth by someone who had spent 8 years determined not to see it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.